says, you take what you want. Verse 10, Lot lifted up his eyes and beheld all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere, before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, even as the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as thou comest unto Zoar. Then Lot chose him all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated themselves, the one from the other. Abram dwelled in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelled in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent towards Sodom. And that brings me to the next point I want to make this morning, and that is that Abram, throughout his whole life, after this call out of his hometown, out of Haran, he was a tent dweller for all of his life. Abram dwelt in tents all of his life. Once he left Haran, now we read back there in Genesis 12 and verse 4 that when he left, he was 75 years old. That's pretty old to be getting a call, right? To strike out into a new field, you're going to become a stranger in a strange land. He was 75 when he got the call. According to Genesis 25 and verse 7, he was 175 when he died. So for 100 years, he lived in a tent. For 100 years. After he came out of Haran, he never again lived in a house. Never lived in a house of wood or stone or brick or clay or mortar or any other thing. His whole life, 100 years, he lived in a tent. Now, I make that point because it says something else about his character, and I think it symbolizes something to us. A house, if you build a house out of wood or brick, it can last a long time. Not long ago, I stayed in a mansion, an old plantation, woodland plantation. The man who owned it gave me a free night there. It was built in 1834. Been totally restored, beautiful place all the way down towards Port Sulphur. Built in 1834, it's over 170 years old. I mean, a house can last a long time. How long does a tent last? Now, I mean, it might last a while, but if you set up a tent outside, it don't last long. The wind gets it, the weather gets it, it bakes, it blows down. It's not meant to be a permanent residence, right? The tent, in fact, speaks of two things: temporary shelter and wilderness. I mean, it speaks of the wilderness, really, because you don't drive down a residential street and see tents in the city with people living in tents. No, they live in houses in the city. The tent is meant for the wilderness, for the solitary places. That's what the tent is for. That's what you think about when you think about a tent. Well, I want you to know what that represents to us. It represents the pilgrim life that you and I are called to, and that Abram was called to. He lived the pilgrim life. He would be a stranger in a strange land over there in this land that God had promised to give him and his heirs. He would be a stranger in a strange land. He never became a citizen. And you know what, beloved? We ought to be pilgrim people. Whether we dwell in a literal tent or not, our bodies are called tents in the Bible. 2 Corinthians 5, Paul calls our body a tabernacle, a tent. Your body's a tent. It's a temporary dwelling. Amen. It's not immortal. That body's going to die. One day we'll put on immortality. But we are called to the pilgrim life. We are to be strangers in this world. We don't belong to the Sodom that is all around us. We're not part of it. We're supposed to be tent dwellers. We're supposed to be people who are separated from that, separated from them, separated from Sodom and the cities of the plain. Are y'all with me? You understand? The picture is a people who are a solitary people, not afraid to be different. People who are strangers and pilgrims throughout their whole life. We don't blend in. We don't fit in. We don't belong. Not to Sodom. We don't belong to Sodom. We don't fit in with Sodom. We are always foreigners and strangers here in this world. Of course, the contrast is, I want you to notice Lot. Abraham, the tent dweller. Verse 12 tells us, Abram dwelled in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelled in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent towards Sodom. He pitched his tent towards Sodom. I want you to notice what the Bible tells us in the very next verse. But the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. The people of Sodom were flagrant sinners. They were vile, and their wickedness was extreme. The men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. But you know, the lure of Sodom was just very great. It was very great. Abram had no problem. Because he was a man of the altar, because he was a man of worship, Sodom couldn't trap him. Its allure couldn't break through to him. He was able to resist its vexations and vices and enticements. But Lot, lacking that heart that Abram had, the heart of worship, the heart of the altar, Lot was attracted to Sodom. And we read right there in verse 12 that first of all, he pitched his tent towards Sodom. You know, he was sort of leaning in that direction. By the time you get to chapter 14, you find out that Lot was living in Sodom. And when Sodom got, plundered, Lot got carried off with it. By the time you get to Genesis chapter 19, you find that not only was Lot living in Sodom, but he was sitting in the gate where business was transacted, where leadership was conducted, where government was, in politics and all that was conducted. So by chapter 19, he was no longer a stranger in Sodom. He was a part of it. He was right there in the middle of it. He had become one of them. I mean, so much so that he was even married to, obviously, a Sodomite woman. You see, when Lot came out with Abram, there's no record that he took a wife with him. When he left Haran, there was no wife that came along with Sodom. It said Lot came with him. But by the time we see him living in Sodom, now he's got a wife and he's got kids. And his kids are married to the men of Sodom. Obviously, many Bible scholars believe that he obviously married a Sodomite woman, that he had these two daughters who were married to Sodomite men. You contrast that with Abraham. What a difference there is. I'm saying that these are contrasts. Two men who started out together. Same road, same journey. Y'all with me? Amen. Abram, when it was time for his son to get married, he said, I don't want my son having a wife from this place. This place is vile. These people are wicked. I don't want my son marrying one of these women. You send back to where we're from and you get a wife for my son. You bring a wife back from back there because I don't want him getting one of these Sodomite women. What a difference, huh? Amen. Abram, who would not dwell anywhere but his tent, who would not embrace the ways of the Canaanites around him. Let me tell you what happened. When Lot started pitching his tent towards Sodom, it was the beginning of the end. Sodom has that attraction. It has that draw. It has that appeal. That's why you and I have to guard against worldliness at every turn. You know, Sodom wants to erode your convictions. Your convictions against sin, the things that you once thought was so abhorrent. Oh my God, those kind of sins are terrible. You know, you hang around Sodom for a while and you'll begin to think, well, you know what? It's not so bad after all. I mean, everybody does it. That's the way everybody else is. You hang around with Sodomites. Now I'm just talking here about, the people of the world, worldly people, lost people, people who are ungodly. You hang around with them, they will influence you. You are pitching your tent towards Sodom. They are becoming influences in your life. You will begin to compromise your holy convictions. Things that you wouldn't have done before, now you do. Look, I see it happen all the time. I see it happen all the time. I see it. A person can have great convictions. They serve God. They worship God. They love God. There's certain things they won't do. There's certain, they would never consider sinful activities. They would never